A Seaside mother is accused of murder by abuse in the death of her 2-year-old daughter.
Her boyfriend is also accused of the death behind bars.
The 911 dispatcher's voice cut through the static, calm but firm.
911, what's your emergency?
A woman's panicked voice cracked through the line. A child! She's not breathing! First responders tore through the streets of Seaside, Oregon, sirens wailing. They arrived at a quiet apartment complex, where the only sounds were muffled sobs. Inside a dimly lit bedroom, they found her, 2-year-old Evangelina Wing, small, fragile, motionless. Bruises covered her tiny frame. Dark marks ringed her neck. Dried blood crusted in her ears. Her body was already stiff. The medics had seen death before, but this told a different story. Bite marks, burns, broken bones. It wasn't just tragedy, it was torture. Seaside, a peaceful beach town, was now the scene of an unthinkable horror. Evangelina had lived here with her mother, Dorothy Wing, and her 2 brothers. Dorothy, a struggling single mom, did her best to keep food on the table. But just weeks before Evangelina's death, a new shadow darkened their doorstep. Randy Roden, a man with a past that should have sent red flags waving like an air traffic controller at rush hour. Instead, within a week of meeting, Dorothy let him move in. Randy stepped into the role of caregiver while she worked long shifts. To the outside world, it might have seemed like a struggling mom catching a break. Inside, a nightmare was unfolding. No one knew what was happening behind that closed door until it was too late. At first glance, Evangelina's death seemed like a tragic accident. Dorothy claimed her daughter had fallen off the toilet days earlier. But as investigators dug deeper, the cracks in her story widened, and what they found was far more sinister. This wasn't a one-time tragedy. It was the final act in a long, brutal nightmare. Months of abuse had left their mark, not just on Evangelina, but on her 2 brothers as well. This wasn't just about one horrific night. It was a chilling tale of cruelty, manipulation, in a system that failed to intervene. What unfolded would go down as one of the most disturbing child abuse cases in Clatsop County's history, leaving an entire community reeling. But before we dive in, a quick shout out to my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and comments help bring these stories to light. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Now let's get started. Evangelina Wing was born on January 22nd, 2011, a little girl with a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Her bright, curious eyes and infectious laughter made her impossible not to love. Her world was small but full of warmth, centered around her 2 brothers, a 5-year-old who adored her and a younger one who matched her endless energy. The 3 of them were inseparable, their giggles echoing through their modest apartment in Seaside, Oregon. Their mother, Dorothy Wing, worked long hours to keep food on the table. Single parenting wasn't easy, but she did her best to make sure her children felt safe and loved. Still, exhaustion clung to her like a shadow. Balancing work and raising 3 kids alone was wearing her down, and those close to her could see it. She wasn't just tired, she was lonely. Then came Randy Roden. Their paths crossed in the fall of 2014, and for Dorothy, it felt like fate. Randy was charming, attentive, and, most importantly, eager to step into the role of a father figure. For a woman drowning in responsibilities, he seemed like a lifeline. But lifelines don't usually come wrapped in red flags.
But what Dorothy didn't know, or maybe refused to see, was the darkness lurking beneath Randy's charm. Randy Roden wasn't just a man with a troubled past. He was a predator wrapped in a nice guy disguise. His criminal record read like a horror novel: domestic violence, sexual assault, kidnapping. Women who crossed his path didn't just leave. They escaped, if they were lucky. Yet somehow he had a talent for slipping past suspicion, playing the role of a protector while hiding the monster underneath. Within a week of meeting Dorothy, he moved into her tiny apartment. The speed of it raised eyebrows, but Dorothy clung to the idea that she was finally getting the support she so desperately needed. She assured friends that Randy was good with the kids, that he made her feel safe, that maybe, just maybe, things were looking up. At first, Randy seemed like a godsend. With Dorothy working long shifts, he stepped in as the primary caregiver. She trusted him, relied on him, but Randy's help came at a cost. Slowly, he tightened his grip, making household decisions without her input, setting rules she never agreed to, controlling everything. His temper simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. He was careful, though. He made sure Dorothy never saw the worst of it, but the children did. At first, the changes were barely noticeable. The kids, once full of energy, started to withdraw. Neighbors who used to see them playing outside now rarely caught a glimpse. When they did, something felt off, a fresh bruise on Evangelina's arm, the 5-year-old limping slightly. Dorothy brushed off concerns, waving them away with a nervous laugh. "Kids fall all the time," she'd say. Inside that apartment, however, the truth was harder to ignore. The warmth that once filled their home had been replaced with tension and fear. Arguments between Dorothy and Randy escalated, their voices echoing through the thin walls. Evangelina, the little girl who used to twirl in the living room, grew quiet. She clung to her brothers, her laughter replaced by silence. Her siblings, too young to understand but old enough to feel the shift, bore their own scars, some visible, others not. By December 2014, the storm inside that apartment was ready to break. Evangelina's light was fading. The bruises could no longer be explained away. What happened next would rip the truth wide open and leave an entire community asking one question: how did no one stop this?
The details of Evangelina's abuse were so horrific they seemed almost impossible to believe, like something ripped from the pages of a nightmare. Her once soft, unblemished skin had become a roadmap of suffering, covered in bruises, cuts, and discoloration. The medical examiner later described the injuries with chilling precision. Deep bruising around her neck, the kind that suggested strangulation, blood pooling in her earlobes, and bite marks covering every single one of her tiny fingers. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, she was missing a fingernail on each hand, a gruesome result of either prolonged torture or sheer, unimaginable brutality. Her left arm, broken from shoulder to wrist, was wrapped in a flimsy ace bandage. Beneath it, a spiral fracture, an injury experts linked to someone violently yanking and twisting her arm. The kind of injury that doesn't just happen, it's inflicted. Seriously, who does this to a child? But Evangelina wasn't the only victim. Her 5-year-old brother's body told its own story of suffering. Deep bruises covered his small frame, healing burns marred his ears and nose, and his pelvis, an area almost never fractured in children, was shattered. His scalp had open lesions, and his eyes, swollen shut, hid the internal hemorrhaging caused by repeated deliberate blows to the face. The youngest, a 2-year-old, wasn't spared either. He suffered facial swelling, countless bruises, and a puncture wound inside his mouth so severe it allowed air to seep into the tissue of his jaw. This wasn't just abuse. This was calculated, sustained torture. The children's own words painted an even darker picture. When questioned by police, the 5-year-old described being chained up like a dog. The marks on his wrists and ankles confirmed his story. He and his brother were locked in their room for hours, sometimes days, denied food, water, and even the most basic human comfort. Randy Roden wasn't just violent, he was methodical, ensuring his cruelty left both physical and psychological scars. Honestly, no child should ever endure this. It was beyond inhumane. It was pure evil. And the apartment? It told its own twisted tale. Toys lay abandoned in dusty corners, untouched and forgotten. The air was thick with the stench of neglect, rotting food, unwashed clothes, and something worse. Fear. It clung to the walls, absorbing the cries of children who had learned that screaming never helped. Evangelina, once a bright and joyful little girl, no longer danced, no longer laughed. Her big, curious eyes had dulled, reflecting nothing but suffering. She clung to her brothers, but even their shared pain couldn't protect her from what was coming. But here's the part that's almost as horrifying as the abuse itself. Dorothy, their mother, stood by and let it happen. Maybe at first she convinced herself that the bruises were just accidents, that the burns were from careless play. But as the injuries worsened, her silence became a choice. And that choice sealed Evangelina's fate. Dorothy wasn't just an overwhelmed single mother. She was a woman trapped in her own cycle of fear and manipulation. Randy came into her life when she was struggling, desperate for help, and he played his role well. He offered what seemed like stability, affection, even security. But there was a price: control, isolation, fear. Maybe in her mind, Dorothy had an inner dialogue playing on a loop. This isn't right, but what can I do? The kids need a father figure. I can't do this alone. Randy had eroded her confidence, twisting her perception of reality until inaction felt like the only option. The neighbors heard the arguments, Randy's voice booming, Dorothy's weak protests trailing off into silence. But those rare moments of defiance never lasted. Whether out of fear, denial, or something far worse, she allowed it all to continue. She let Randy discipline the children. She ignored their cries, and eventually she turned a blind eye to the bruises, the fractures, the sheer agony written across her daughter's face. And by the time she could no longer ignore the truth, it was far too late.
By December 2014, Evangelina's tiny body had reached its breaking point. She barely moved, her once bright eyes now hollow and distant. The relentless abuse had drained every last ounce of energy. Playing with her siblings? Impossible. Even eating felt like too much. Every breath she took seemed like a battle she was losing. On December 19th, she was visibly deteriorating, weak, silent, barely present. Dorothy noticed but did what she always did. Nothing. Maybe she told herself it was just exhaustion. Maybe she just didn't want to face the truth. Randy, of course, brushed off any concern. "She'll be fine, let her rest," he muttered, dismissing her suffering like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That night, Evangelina was placed in Dorothy's bed. By the early hours of December 20th, the horror that had been building for months reached its final devastating climax. Dorothy found her daughter unresponsive, cold, stiff, her tiny body frozen in place, covered in bruises and deep discoloration. Panic finally set in. She grabbed the phone, her voice shaking as she dialed 911. "My daughter isn't breathing." Paramedics arrived minutes later, but the damage had long been done. What they saw inside that apartment would haunt them forever. Evangelina's lifeless form lay there, a heartbreaking testament to months of suffering. Her body, locked in rigor mortis, told the story of relentless violence and neglect. There was no mystery here. This wasn't an accident. This was murder.
The apartment was a house of horrors. When responders stepped inside, they were met with a scene that would haunt them forever. Two small boys sat silently on a worn mattress, their hollow eyes staring into nothingness. The 5-year-old's face was barely recognizable. Swollen beyond belief, his eyes nearly shut from internal bleeding. Burns seared his nose and ears, and his pelvis had been fractured, a horrifyingly rare injury in children. And then there was the 2-year-old. Barely more than a baby, his tiny body was littered with bruises. A puncture wound in his mouth hinted at a level of cruelty no one wanted to imagine. The danger was clear. These children weren't just abused, they were actively being tortured. Rescuers wasted no time, whisking the boys to Randall Children's Hospital for emergency evaluations. Meanwhile, their so-called guardians, Dorothy and Randy, were placed in custody. Dorothy looked lost, her face shifting between fear, guilt, and shock. But Randy, not a flicker of remorse. His expression was blank, his posture relaxed, like he had just been pulled over for a broken taillight. Authorities quickly realized this wasn't just neglect. This was something far darker, something deliberate. The investigation kicked into high gear, and the autopsy on little Evangelina left no doubt. This was no tragic accident. The medical examiner documented her injuries, each one telling a chilling story of prolonged brutality, cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head. Her skull showed massive hemorrhaging, her brain swollen from repeated, forceful impacts. This wasn't a fall, this was a beating. And that was just the beginning. Her left arm had been twisted into a spiral fracture, an injury so specific that doctors knew exactly what had happened. Someone had grabbed, yanked, and twisted with monstrous force. Adult-sized bite marks covered her fingers. Fingernails? Ripped clean off, leaving raw, exposed flesh beneath. It got worse. Discoloration around her neck, broken capillaries in her eyes, signs of strangulation. Her tiny body was a roadmap of suffering, with scars, bruises, and lacerations in different stages of healing. This wasn't a one-time attack. This was sustained, systematic torture. As doctors examined the boys, the horror deepened. The 5-year-old's fractured pelvis alone was devastating. His burns, scalp lesions, and battered face painted a picture of unthinkable cruelty. The 2-year-old's mouth wound, facial bruising, and old, untreated injuries were more proof. These children had been living in hell. The evidence was overwhelming. Police turned their focus to Dorothy and Randy. Dorothy was charged with manslaughter and criminal mistreatment, her inaction seen as complicity. Randy? He faced the full weight of the law. Murder, manslaughter, assault, and abuse charges stacked against him like a rap sheet from hell. Search warrants unearthed even more horrors. Bloodstained clothing, chains used to restrain the children. Yes, chains. Neighbors recalled hearing screams, but no one had intervened. The walls of that apartment had absorbed every cry, every plea for help that never came. During questioning, Dorothy painted herself as a victim, broken and manipulated. "I didn't know what to do," she claimed. But as investigators laid out the mountain of evidence, her own daughter's suffering, her son's shattered bodies, her excuses fell apart. The case rocked the nation, but one question loomed over everything. What punishment could ever fit such monstrous acts? In court, the prosecution pulled no punches. Randy Roden wasn't just an abusive stepfather, he was the architect of a living nightmare. He preyed on a vulnerable mother and turned a home into a torture chamber. They laid out a chilling timeline. Summer 2014, Evangelina and her brothers were happy, healthy, full of life. Then in October, Randy moved in. The bruises started small, then multiplied, then deepened. By December, Evangelina was unrecognizable. When the prosecution revealed the full extent of her injuries, the courtroom fell silent. Bite marks, torn fingernails, blunt force trauma. They weren't describing a child who fell off a toilet. They were describing the victim of cold-blooded torture. The jury saw the photos, the before and after. A beaming little girl with bright eyes reduced to a battered, lifeless body. The prosecutor's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Evangelina didn't just suffer, she was hunted. The verdict would come, but no punishment could erase what happened in that apartment. The real question wasn't just how they would be sentenced, but how they had been allowed to do this for so long. And that, perhaps, was the darkest truth of all.
Witness after witness took the stand, each one painting a darker picture of the horrors inside that apartment. Neighbors recalled the gut-wrenching screams, the desperate cries of children echoing through the walls. It was no secret. Something evil had been happening behind that door. But the prosecution wasn't just here to talk about bruises and broken bones. They wanted the jury to see who Randy really was. And that meant digging into his past. A past riddled with domestic violence, manipulation, and control. Court records laid it all out. A man who had spent years hurting women and children, masking his cruelty behind fake kindness. The evidence was suffocating. But Randy's defense team? Oh, they had a strategy. One that reeked of desperation. Instead of addressing the abuse, they pulled a plot twist straight out of a bad medical drama. Evangelina, they claimed, hadn't been murdered. No, she had died from an undetected staph infection that had led to sepsis. A forensic pathologist for the defense took the stand, insisting that the infection had spread through her bloodstream, shutting down her organs. And those bruises, the bite marks, the defense argued they weren't injuries at all, but rather symptoms of the infection. Because apparently bacterial infections love leaving perfectly shaped adult teeth marks. But they didn't stop there. If medical mystery didn't work, they had a backup plan. Blame Dorothy. Randy's lawyers flipped the script, painting Dorothy as a manipulative, neglectful mother with a history of hurting her own kids. They produced old photos of the children with minor injuries, claiming she'd been the real abuser long before Randy entered the picture. Randy, they argued, wasn't a monster, just a good guy trying to keep a broken family together. And for the grand finale, they went after the bite mark evidence calling forensic odontology unreliable and questioning why certain tests weren't performed. The goal? To make the jury doubt, to make them hesitate. But here's the problem with that strategy. The truth doesn't hesitate. The injuries were too brutal, too calculated to be explained away by some rare infection or a few parenting mistakes. The jury saw the reality. This wasn't bad luck. This was torture. And no amount of legal gymnastics could twist that into anything else.
The trial was an emotional battlefield. Doctors, detectives, and forensic experts took the stand, their voices steady, but their eyes told another story. Beneath the professionalism, there was something raw, anguish. One pediatrician, detailing the extent of the children's injuries, paused mid-sentence, gripping the witness stand as if it might hold her together. Her voice cracked as she described Evangelina's arm, spiral fractured, twisted like someone had wrung the life out of it. The jury sat frozen. Some turned away as crime scene photos flashed on the screen. Others wiped away silent tears. But the worst moment? A recording of Evangelina's 5-year-old brother, his tiny voice describing how he and his siblings had been chained up like animals in their own home. And then, after weeks of testimony, after every horrific detail had been laid bare, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Murder. Manslaughter. Assault. Criminal mistreatment. The judge delivered the sentence. 40 years. It wasn't enough to undo the suffering, but at least Randy Roden was finally where he belonged, locked away. But justice, as it turns out, has a loophole. Years later, Randy's lawyers came crawling back with an appeal. Their argument? The prosecution's bite mark evidence was scientifically questionable. To the shock and outrage of the community, the Oregon Court of Appeals actually listened. Randy's sentence was cut in half. 20 years. The man who had tortured children would walk free 2 decades sooner. He gets to breathe fresh air again? He gets a second chance? One neighbor fumed. Evangelina doesn't. Dorothy, who had cut a deal with prosecutors in exchange for testifying against Randy, wasn't exactly let off the hook either. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and child mistreatment, receiving 15 years. Some saw her punishment as a slap on the wrist. Others called it necessary. She stood by while her kids were tortured, an activist argued. 15 years isn't justice, it's an insult. But legal experts pushed back. Dorothy wasn't just a bystander, they said. She was trapped, manipulated and controlled by Randy. Victims of abusers don't always fight back, one criminal psychologist explained. Sometimes they're too broken to even try. The case became a war zone for public opinion. Some saw the plea deal as the only way to ensure Randy's conviction. Others saw it as proof the system had failed twice. And speaking of failure, the cracks in the system ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. How did a man with a history of domestic violence and probation violations move in with children without a single red flag? How did Child Protective Services never step in? This was failure at every level, a child welfare advocate said bluntly. Probation officers, the courts, even the neighbors. So many chances to stop this, and no one did. The outrage sparked real change. Activists demanded stricter background checks, more training for social workers, and better oversight for families at risk. No more, we didn't know. No more excuses. But none of it would bring Evangelina back. She was just a little girl, laughing, playing, finding joy in the simplest things. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Her story is more than a tragedy. It's a warning. How many more children have to suffer before we decide to pay attention? Every child deserves a safe home. But for too many, home is the most dangerous place of all.
Child abuse isn't just a tragedy, it's an epidemic. And the numbers, they're downright terrifying. In 2022 alone, more than 558,000 children in the U.S. were confirmed victims of abuse and neglect. That's 8 kids out of every 1,000, a statistic that should shake every one of us. But here's the real kicker. The most common form of abuse isn't physical, it's neglect. A staggering 74.3% of victims suffered from it. And neglect isn't just forgetting to pack a lunch. It's the gateway to deeper, long-term damage. Now, if those numbers didn't make you uncomfortable, This will, 5 children die every single day because of abuse. In 2021, the official count was 1,820 lives lost. Kids who never got a chance to grow up, dream, or even experience a safe home. And the system completely overwhelmed. In 2022, 4.3 million cases were reported to Child Protective Services, covering a jaw-dropping 7.5 million children. Yet despite investigations, millions of kids still slipped through the cracks. That means right now, somewhere, a child is trapped in a nightmare, waiting for someone to notice. The worst part? Many of these cases could have been prevented, but too often abuse stays hidden behind closed doors until it's too late. And at that point, the only people left counting are the coroners. So the question isn't just, how do we stop this? The real question is, how many more children have to suffer before we do?
Abuse doesn't end when the bruises fade. For many survivors, the damage sticks around, buried deep, shaping their future in ways most people never see. Here's a chilling fact. Kids who experience abuse or neglect are 9 times more likely to engage in criminal activity later in life. And if that's not disturbing enough, 8 out of 10 abused children grow up to develop at least one psychological disorder. That's 80% of survivors carrying invisible scars, battling demons they never asked for. These aren't just numbers on a report. They're real lives, real pain, real futures stolen before they even had a chance. And yet, time and time again, the system fails them. So what do we do? Ignore the problem until the next tragic headline? Or finally take a stand, turning these grim statistics into stories of recovery, strength, and second chances? Every single one of these numbers represents a child who needed someone to notice, to step in, to care. The question is, will we let history repeat itself, or will we fight to make sure no more children suffer in silence? And that brings us to one of the most haunting cases in recent history, the tragic story of Evangelina Wing. A case that forces us to confront the ugliest side of humanity. Justice was served, but was it enough? Reduced sentences, a system that failed to protect, and brothers left behind to pick up the shattered pieces of their childhood. Can any punishment truly measure up to the horrors endured? What could have been done differently? Could a neighbor, a teacher, or a stranger have stepped in before it was too late? And how do we make sure this never happens again? Your voice matters. Your awareness could be the difference between another forgotten case and a child saved. If you want more stories that demand to be heard, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Some stories should never be buried.